Hello, welcome to another episode of The Road to October. Thank you for listening to this episode after we took a short break for the holiday season, but now we're back for another year of World Series action. This year we are covering the 1905 season. We're going to start this episode with a little bit of a recap of what happened in 1904 and the off season going into the 1905 season. We're also switching things up and including video components with this. So hopefully it'll be a change for the better and we'll only see improvements with the podcast from here on out. So let's go ahead and get started. The 1903 World Series was a spectacle of the sport, the first of its kind for baseball. The country was riveted and hoping for more in the 1904 season. However, due to the begrudging of a National League owner, his feelings of superiority, and the refusal to play against what he viewed as an inferior league, there was no Fall Classic, no postseason games, no World Series champion. New York Giants had dominated the National League with a 106-47 record. The Boston Americans of the American League finished with a 95-59 record. These two teams would have met in the World Series. Both teams were led by excellent pitching. Cy Young and Bill Dineen for Boston, and Joe McGinty and Christy Mathewson for New York. Who would have came out on top? We'll never know. But it's kind of fun to think about what this would have looked like, how it would have gone down in history. We did a couple of mini episodes to kind of fill the gap for the 1904 season, so make sure to go back and listen to those if you have a chance. But let's not just focus on team accomplishments. We'll cover some individual accomplishments for that season as well. So some of the names that were excelling on an individual level. First, we'll look at some of the pitchers. Rube Waddell for the Philadelphia Athletics led baseball in both WAR and strikeouts. He had a WAR of 11.3 and struck out 349. Jack Cresbo of the New York Highlanders led in wins with 41. He also had the most complete games at 48. And when you have the most complete games, you will typically lead in innings pitched, which he did with 454 innings. Across the city in New York, Joe McGinty of the New York Giants led the National League in ERA with a 1.61 ERA. And so let's take a look at some hitters around the league for the 1904 season. Nap Lajouet of the Cleveland Napoleons was far and away the best hitter that season, putting up an 8.5 WAR with 208 hits. That was 22 more than the next closest batter. Also led in doubles, RBIs, batting average, on-base percentage, and slugging percentage. Honus Wagner of the Pittsburgh Pirates was dominating in the National League. He led that league in most major statistics. Home runs were not a significant part of the game as they are today. The ball didn't fly out of the stadium like they do, and a lot of the fields were also, the dimensions were far too big for the ball to fly out with regularity. So you had a lot more inside the park home runs. Harry Davis of the Philadelphia Athletics led the league with 10 home runs. Lastly, Buck Freeman and Chick Stahl of the Boston Americans and Joe Cassidy of the Washington Senators were tied for the league lead with 19 triples. So this is kind of the beginning of baseball, so there wasn't any awards that were given out at the end of the season like there is today. We can kind of guess or make assumptions about who would have likely won those awards. The MVPs were likely been given to Nap Lajouet of the American League and Honus Wagner of the National League. Cy Young was still playing at the time, but had he had his own award like he does today, the award likely would have been given to Jack Cresbo of the American League with his 41 wins and 1.82 ERA, and Joe McGinty of the National League with his 35 wins and 1.16 ERA. So before we take a look at the state of baseball before the 1905 season, I think it would be beneficial to take a wider, more world view of what was occurring. so we can gain some better understanding of what might have been influencing the sports world at the time. One of the big world events that was going on was the Russo-Japanese War that was dominating a lot of the headlines. It's considered to be one of the first major wars of the 20th century. Japan was rapidly modernizing and becoming an industrial power. At the same time, Russia was an old European empire. They were both trying to either gain more control or keep hold of what they had already conquered. So there was land for grabs. So in the past, Japan had gained control of the Korean peninsula and was further looking to expand its empire. On February 8th, 1904, Japan declared war. And in October, Japan looked to take over a strategic port that Russia had been leasing in Korea called Port Arthur. Eventually, the port fell to Japan in 1905, and the war itself would see Japan as the victor and having a greater presence on the global stage. This was kind of the beginning of Russia's problems. They were having issues on the battlefield and at home as well. Tsar Nicholas II was widely viewed as an incompetent ruler and faced an uprising. Thousands of Russians marched towards the Tsar's Winter Palace, and troops were dispatched to deal with those individuals. This was one of the many Russian revolutions that would come to fruition. Meanwhile, back in the United States, Teddy Roosevelt won the 1904 presidential election. He ran on a platform of breaking up large corporations and building the Panama Canal. America itself was growing through immigration. The electrical system was expanding. Before this time, most houses didn't have electricity, but the grid was rapidly expanding, allowing for indoor lighting. People didn't have to live by candlelight anymore. The Wright brothers were also continuing to improve their planes that they were building. And they had already taken flight at Kitty Hawk by this time, but they were further looking to refine their planes and take them around the country to show off what they had accomplished. Elsewhere, Europe was experiencing one of its coldest winters. In Switzerland, a young patent clerk named Albert Einstein, unknown to the world at this time, was finishing a doctoral thesis and beginning a burst of creativity that would soon rewrite physics itself. His miracle year was only months away. So let's go back to baseball. It's what everyone's here for, right? So before the start of the 1905 season, baseball was in a state of flux. John T. Brush, who we did a mini episode on, he was the owner of the Giants. He had refused to play the American League champs, and newspapers and fans around the country were very upset and directed a lot of anger and resentment towards him. They accused him of cowardice, arrogance, and even worse. The public didn't really take his excuses or explanation of why he didn't want to play the Boston Americans at the time. And it just really came down to John T. Brush's resentment towards Ban Johnson. So Ban Johnson actually seized on the opportunity, and he held press conferences, fired off statements, and reminded everyone almost daily that his league, the American League, was ready and willing to play. And it's a quote, through the winter meetings, league politics were practically a blood sport. Ban Johnson walked into the offseason stronger than ever. The AL had a clean public image, stable financials, and was the defending champion. The NL, on the other hand, was fractured. Some NL owners hated that the Giants had refused to play the series. Others supported Brush's stance that postseason play was a circus that encouraged gambling and chaos. Behind closed doors, it became clear if baseball was going to have a World Series again, the National League needed to get its house in order, and they needed Brush to stop being the villain in every sports column. So, John T. Brush, the man who is blamed for the killing the 1904 World Series spent the winter quietly designing the blueprint that would save the World Series. In December and January, he drafted a formal championship framework, rules for player shares, rules for gate receipts, neutral umpires, travel procedures, a system to prevent disputes before they even started. By February, he circulated the brush rules amongst the owners, and nearly everyone in baseball liked the rules that he created. So these rules were eventually agreed upon and established what would become known as the World Series. So now we can go ahead and take a look at the two teams that would eventually meet in the World Series in 1905. First, we'll start out with the New York Giants, John T. Brush's team. So as we previously said, they were coming off a really impressive 1904 season, 106-47 record. John McGraw was again the manager, and they were playing their games at Polo Grounds, one of the most famous stadiums ever built. Much of the 1904 roster returned for the 1905 season, and they were looking to repeat what had been accomplished the previous season, this time with a World Series title to cap off the season. So let's take a look at the roster. Catching the majority of the games was Roger Bresnahan. At first was Dan McGann. The second baseman, Billy Gilbert. Third baseman, Art Devlin. Manning shortstop was Bill Dolan. And in the outfield was Mike Donlin, Sam Mertes, and George Brown. Pitching staff was composed of Christy Mathewson, Joe McGinty, Red Ames, Luther Taylor, and Hooks Wiltsey. Mike Donlin led the offense in WAR, runs, and hits, as well as doubles, batting average, on-base percentage, and slugging percentage. Sam Mertes did lead the team in triples, and Art Devlin led the team in stolen bases and walks, but Mike Donlin was the major driving force behind the offense. Pretty much every category he led in, including tied for the lead with home runs with Bill Dolan. So let's take a look at their pitchers real quick. Christy Mathewson was the best pitcher on the team in the 1905 season. He led the team in WAR, wins, ERA, complete games, shutouts, innings pitched, strikeouts, and posted an ERA plus of 233, which is ERA plus is a scale where 100 is average. So you can imagine he's more than twice a league average pitcher at that time. Claude Elliott led the team in saves with 6. The Giants started their season on April 14th, 1905, with a home game against the Boston Nationals in front of roughly 40,000 fans. The fans in attendance for this Friday afternoon opening day game were in for a show of dominance displayed by the Giants. The Giants scored 2 runs in the first inning and would never cede the lead to the Nationals. Joe McGinnity pitched a complete game, only allowing a single run. The Giants offense would go on to add 8 more runs to complete a 10-1 victory to start their season. With this victory, the Giants would eventually complete their season without spending a day under 500. They would eventually go on to finish the season 105-48-2, 9 games ahead of the Pittsburgh Pirates. During the season, the Giants had a 13-game winning streak, and their longest losing streak was only 4 games. The pitching staff threw 18 shutouts, and the offense was only shut out 10 times. The Giants had a 720 win percentage at home with a 654 win percentage on the road. Looks like the Giants had the best win percentage against the Boston Nationals at 864, and their worst record against was the Cubs and the Pirates, where they're still above 500 at 545. The Giants would finish the regular season on October 7th with a doubleheader against the Philadelphia Phillies. Giants would take the first game with a 4-3 victory, while falling to the Phillies in the second game 6-1. Finishing first in the National League would see the Giants in the World Series a year after they refused to play the previous season. So let's now see who they would be playing against in the World Series. And that team is the Philadelphia Athletics. The 1904 season for the Philadelphia Athletics was a bit of a disappointment. They finished with a winning record, 81-70, but that was 12 and a half games behind the first place Boston Americans for what was a fifth place finish in the league. Connie Mack returned as manager for the Athletics, and the Athletics played their home games at Columbia Park. Much of their roster remained the same between the 1904 and 1905 seasons. So let's go ahead and take a look at that roster. Catching for the Athletics was O.C. Schreckengast. Harry Davis was the first baseman. Danny Murphy was the second baseman. John Knight was at shortstop, and Lave Cross was at third base. In the outfield was Topsy Hartzell, Sox Siebold, and Danny Hoffman. Harry Davis was possibly the best bat for the Athletics this season, leading the team in WAR, runs, hits, doubles, home runs, RBIs, batting average, and slugging percentage. While Danny Hoffman led the team in steals and, unfortunately, strikeouts, Topsy Hartzell led the team in walks and on-base percentage. The pitching staff was made up of Eddie Plank, Rube Waddell, Andy Coakley, Charles Bender, and Weldon Henley. The 28-year-old Rube Waddell was the second oldest arm on the team, but he was their best pitcher. He led the team in WAR, wins, games pitched, ERA, shutouts, strikeouts, and posted an ERA plus of 181. Interestingly, there were no saves recorded by the Athletics this season. The season for the Athletics started on April 14th with a home game against the Boston Americans. The Athletics won that game against Cy Young 3-2. Boston mounted a ninth inning rally, but ended up falling short. Similarly to the Giants, the Athletics never spent a day with a losing record. On October 5th, the Athletics had their most games over 500 at 38 games over 500. Their longest win streak was 7 games. Their longest losing streak was only 3 games, which happened multiple times during the season, but only lasted a maximum of 3 games. The Philadelphia pitching staff shut out teams 19 times, and the offense was only shut out 10 times. The Athletics home road split for winning percentage was .699 at home and .547 on the road. The best win percentage against a team that the Athletics had was against Boston, Cleveland, and St. Louis, while their worst win percentage was against the Washington Nationals. But again, similar to the Giants, it was still over 500. The Athletics finished their season with a doubleheader. The Athletics finished the season on October 7th against the Washington Nationals. The Athletics lost the first game 5-4 and tied the second game 3-3. This was enough to finish the season 2 games ahead of the Chicago White Sox, and then they had a final record of 92-56. So now that we know which 2 teams will be playing in the World Series, first game of the 1905 World Series would take place on October 9th, 1905. The first game would be played at the Columbia Park in Philadelphia. Christy Mathewson and Eddie Plank would toe the rubber for their respective teams. Though this is not the first officially recognized World Series, it is the first recognized under the new rules that were codified in the previous offseason. So look forward to covering those games. Thank you for listening to this episode of The Road to October. In the coming episodes, we will go game by game, at bat by at bat, as we cover the 1905 World Series between the New York Giants and the Philadelphia Athletics. Make sure to like, subscribe, rate, and review on your favorite podcast platform. I'm your host, Ryan Lorenz, and thank you again for listening.